Get started. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our Center for Process Studies seminar with Dr. James McLachlan. Welcome to our online audience as well as our studio audience. Because we're such a large group here this afternoon, I think I will forego the ritual of self-introduction and we'll just begin with the introduction. Before I give the introduction, let me welcome you to the John Cobb book signing. That's just 48 hours from now in the quad at the Claremont School of Theology. He'll be signing his book, Jesus, Abba, the God Who Has Not Failed. That's 48 hours from now, April 20th at 4:30 p.m. School of Theology quad. Professor James McLachlan is the professor of philosophy and religion at Western Carolina University in North Carolina. He's author of 2 books, The Desire to Be God, Freedom and the Other in Sartre and Berjayev, also William H. Chamberlain, Mormon Idealist. He has edited 2 books, Discourses in Mormon Theology and Philosophical and Religious Conceptions of the Person and Their Implications for Ethical, Political, and Social Thought. Dr. McLachlan is a founder and past chair of the Mormon Studies Group at the American Academy of Religion. He's organizer of the Personalist Seminar and co-director of the Levinas Summer Seminar. Dr. McLachlan is also co-editor of Element, a journal of Mormon philosophy and theology. He's been past president of the Society of Mormon Philosophy and Theology. Professor McLachlan is currently a visiting scholar here at the Center for Process Studies. Will you welcome him and his discussion of a Mormon process theodicy? Dr. McLachlan.
Move this out of the way. Okay. Hey, Richard. I'll say a little bit about myself and process theology. Just to start out, I kind of backed into this. I was a grad student at the University of Toronto, and my specialty is continental philosophy, but I ended up in a seminar on Whitehead. That was interesting. And then my wife, Carrie, back there, we went to Indiana University where she did her master's, and I had a friend there who was a Husserl scholar. But the semester that we both sat in on a class, he was teaching process theology. Years later, I was in a book on Mormonism and 20th century theology, and I thought they were going to give me something on continental philosophy, and they wanted me to respond to a paper from David Griffin on process theology. A couple of years after that, Carrie decided to go to graduate school in Native American history. She had a choice between Oklahoma and Riverside. Luckily, she chose Riverside, and I ended up here for a year at the Center for Process Studies as a visiting scholar. So I just decided to embrace it after a while because it made so much sense to me anyway. Well, let's get started here. I want to start with a quote from a book by Mark Twain. And if you really want something more exciting than this, you can go to the internet and get on, well, this is actually pretty exciting. The quote's not on the internet that I'm going to tell you about, but you can watch a little bit of Will Vinton's The Adventures of Mark Twain, which has this rather strange vignette in it from Twain's Mysterious Stranger. The Mysterious Stranger is an odd book. It was published after Twain's death. He wouldn't publish it during his lifetime because it is one of the most incredibly depressing books you will ever read. It's the dark side of Mark Twain, the dark side of Mark Twain. It's even perhaps the solipsistic side of Mark Twain, but I don't think that's really what's going on in here. But the story is about a bunch of several boys who are living in 16th century Austria, and they one day meet an angel. The angel's name is Satan. He's not the famous Satan, though. He's this famous Satan's nephew. This is also a book I think everybody who does process philosophy should read, or process theology should read, because it's a bruising critique of classical theism. Okay. It's Twain against the Calvinism of his youth. Okay, so we're going to end the book, so I'm going to ruin it for you. By the way, Twain also wrote a hilarious piece on the Mormons in his book Roughing It, if you ever want to read something like that. But anyway, this is the angel revealing to Theodore, one of the boys, that this is all an insane dream in Theodore's head. Strange that you should not have suspected years ago, centuries ago, eons ago, for you have existed companionless through all the eternity. Strange, indeed, that you should not have suspected that your universe and its contents were only dreams, visions. Strange because they are so frankly and hysterically insane. You know, he's going to take off on his tirade on the Calvinist God. Like all dreams, a God who could make good children as easy as bad, yet preferred to make bad ones, who could make every one of them happy, yet never made a single happy one, who made them prize their bitter life, yet stingingly cut it short, who gave his angels eternal happiness unearned, yet required his other children to earn it, who gave his angels painless lives, yet cursed his other children with biting miseries and maladies of mind and body, who mouths justice and invented hell, mouths mercy and invented hell, mouths golden rules and forgiveness multiplied 70 times 7 and invented hell, who mouths morals to others and has none himself, who frowns upon crimes yet commits them all, who created man without invitation, yet then tries to shuffle the responsibility for man's acts upon man, instead of honorably placing it where it belongs, upon himself. And finally, with altogether divine obtuseness, invites this poor, abused slave to worship him. You perceive that these things are all impossible except in a dream. You perceive that they are the pure and puerile insanities, the silly creations of an imagination not conscious of its freaks. In a word, they are a dream and you are the maker of it. The dream marks are all present and you should have recognized them earlier. Okay, Twain goes on, actually, in that passage to tell Theodore he should go dream better dreams. And thus ends Mark Twain's bleak and blistering indictment of theism, the mysterious stranger. The question here is not whether one can show, as theistic thinkers from Augustine to Alvin Plantinga have done, that it is logically consistent to believe in such an omnipotent and omnipresent being that exists outside of space and time and created a world ex nihilo. The real question is for Twain, is why anyone, except perhaps out of fear and awe for the tremendous power of such a being, would worship him. Many of the most famous literary rebels, from Ivan Karamazov to Dr. Rieu in Camus' The Plague, rebelled against such a being, and it was not the simple logical incoherence of the idea of God and evil that bothered them. It was the notion that an all-powerful, perfect, and self-sufficient deity could create a world full of sinners whose fate would be temporal suffering here and eternal suffering hereafter. That this being was so perfect that he required no world and no other besides himself, yet created them anyway. Many to suffer here, others to suffer eternally. Twain's 19th century Mormon contemporaries, Joseph Smith, Brigham Young, the Pratt brothers, Parley and Orson, I've got another list of them here, didn't believe in such a deity, and perhaps escape indictment for the indictment that such a worldview implies. The Mormon philosopher Sterling McMurrin claimed that Mormonism was in principle basically non-absolutistic. This did not mean that in their everyday discourse, Mormons didn't talk about God using the same absolutist terms as other Christians, only that in their idea of God, their idea of God would not let them do so consistently. The absolutism that McMurrin claimed that Mormons should never lust after, as a matter of fact, that's what he said. He said Mormons often lust after the flesh pots of absolutism. Claim that God is utterly distinct from all realities other than himself, who possesses all of the following characteristics: causal ultimacy, being the temporal and or metaphysical source of all realities other than the divine nature itself; complete sovereignty or unrivaled, uncontestable power and dominion over all reality; eternity, being timeless and immutable and thus outside of space and time; simple, not having a composite nature, not being composed of parts, hence literally incorruptible. God participates in no genus or species and thus exists as pure being. And of course, he possesses the famous omnis, omniscience, having complete and infallible knowledge of everything that can be known; omnipotence, being capable of precipitating or causing any event or situation, the bringing about of which is A, is not logically impossible, or B, incompatible with the other attributes of the divine nature. Of course, if you're with Occam and Luther, the first one is not necessarily the case. Omnipresence or immutability, changelessness, existing outside and independently of the stream of temporal events, and thus ever present. And finally, omnibenevolence, being absolutely and infallibly good, incapable of moral error, malice, or wrongdoing. God is also unique in that he possesses the foregoing attributes in such a way that could not conceivably be duplicated or even remotely imitated. For Charles Hartshorne, of course, this way of viewing God is exclusively monopolar. Let's see, I've got, there we go. This is Hartshorne's famous creations of the poles that we talk about when we talk about perfection. But in classical theism, the classical divinity possesses all these. Creaturely deficient being possesses all these. The strong elements, power, eternity, activity, are favored over the weak elements, openness, temporality, and passivity, including compassion. As Whitehead would say about the development of classical theism, when the Western world accepted Christianity, Caesar conquered. This is toward the end of Process and Reality. And the received text of Western theology was edited by his lawyers. I like that. As obscure as Whitehead is sometimes, he does have literary talent. Okay, the Code of Justinian and the Theology of Justinian are two volumes of expressing one movement of the human spirit. The brief Galilean vision of humanity flickered throughout the ages, uncertainly. In the official formulation of the religion, it has assumed the trivial form of the mere attribution to the Jews that they cherished a misconception about their Messiah. But the deeper idolatry of the fashioning of God in the image of the Egyptian, Persian, and Roman imperial rulers was retained. The church gave unto God the attributes which belonged exclusively to Caesar. Oops, wrong way. As we shall see, like process thinkers, it's hard to imagine how, without radically redefining these characteristics of the transcendent deity of classical theism, how any of them would fit the Mormon idea of God. Mormon theologies, even in their most conservative versions, don't see God as completely ontologically distinct from human beings especially, but perhaps all beings. For Joseph Smith's God emerges as an embodied human being. This is important to note at the beginning because the traditional problem of evil does not arise for Mormons in the same way it does for theists. Or to be more precise, it arises only to be dismissed. We cheat a lot. Once Mormons pass from the language they share about God with other Christians, which Mormons, and one might argue the entire Judeo-Christian scriptural tradition, use hyperbolically as a language of praise, to discussion of the problem in more philosophical terms. At this point, they fall back on the authoritative pronouncements of their unique scriptural traditions and founding authorities in which terms like omnipotence are defined in ways different from most of the theistic traditions. Omnipotence, for example, has been used in Mormon writings to mean almighty, or almighty in the sense of all the power that a being can possess, given that they exist alongside other self-existing free beings that logically limit omnipotence. Okay, we're going to have to explain what all that means. Just as most creedal Christians and traditional theists place limits on omnipotence when they define it as God doing what is logically possible, so Mormons and process thinkers argue this means that God is limited by the activity of other free beings. This reasoning seems to be that it is just as consistent to say that God would force beings to act against their freedom as to say that God could create square circles. Both violate the rules of logic. The first statement, misunderstood, is to misunderstand freedom, and the second is to misunderstand geometry. Thus, God is understood as having all the power that any being could have, and is, in religious terms, almighty. But just as for the process theologian, such statements follow from a radically theologically reconceived idea of God, so are Mormon conceptions of God radically different from most creedal Christians and most theists, even process theists. Despite their shared rhetoric in relation to God, it is almost as meaningless to apply the standard formulations of the logical and evidential problems of evil to Mormons as it is to Buddhists. The problems confronting Mormons relating the problem of evil and suffering are, as they are for Buddhists and at least some process theologians, different from those confronting creedal Christians and most traditional theists. I'm not saying that Mormon ideas of divinity have eliminated the problem of suffering any more than Buddhists have. But the problem has to be understood quite differently from Mormons than for creedal Christians or traditional theists. The problems that arise for Mormons have more to do with the possible eschatological triumph over evil and suffering than with whether or not God is responsible for it. Okay, now this next part I'm going to move through fairly quickly. We'll just look at the slides. Now, this is the traditional logical problem of evil that most people are familiar with. Here is the famous formulation from Epicurus via David Hume, that God could remove evil out of the world and cannot, he can or will not, or he has not the power nor the will, or lastly, he has both the power and the will. If he has the will and not the power, that shows weakness, which is contrary to the nature of God. If he has the power and not the will, that's malignity, which is Mark Twain's God. And this is no less contrary to his nature. If he is neither able nor willing, he is both impotent and malignant, and consequently cannot be God. If he is both willing and able, which is alone consonant with the nature of God, whence comes evil and why does he not prevent it? If you read David Griffin's God, Power, and Evil, and Evil Revisited, you have a much more complicated version of this basic setup here. But here it is. God's omnipotent, omniscient, all-powerful, created everything and knows everything, and omnibenevolent, completely good. Why do suffering and evil exist? Or would, Okay, now we have several things coming up that are going to come up because of this, through the tradition. The favorite way to get around it is to claim that evil is prima facie or only apparent. Okay, there's a wonderful William Blake from his book on Job. To push back against that tradition is to argue, as people like David Griffin do and Marjorie Zwocky, that there is genuine evil, or to borrow one of my favorite terms from a personalist philosopher who actually was probably the key philosophical inspiration for Martin Luther King, a guy named Edgar Sheffield Brightman. Taught at Boston University up until the 1950s. He coined the term dysteleological surds. It's just a wonderful term, meaning that there are some things that happen that serve no higher purpose at all. They have no teleology to them. That would be, any kind of genuine evil. Actually, dysteleological surds takes in more than just genuine evil, things that just are neutral as well. But something genuinely evil that served no higher purpose, no good would come from it, would be a dysteleological surd. Okay. We're talking about theodicies here, and we're generally talking about the three types of evil here: moral, sin, natural evil, things like diseases, floods, and earthquakes, and metaphysical evil, the fact that not everybody can be God. Okay, let me move on. I wanted to get through that fairly quickly. Okay, but let's take a look at the contention here that the way the tradition more or less uses this is to aestheticize it. Okay, so you have to get aesthetic solutions to the problem of evil. Most famous ones in the past, of course, being formulated by Augustine. This is a wonderful quotation here that we are promised eventually a vision of beauty. If I'm going to skip through a lot of this. So if we pray well and get a glimpse of beauty, of the divine good, it won't trouble us if one man is able to have children while another one casts out his own offsprings as being unduly numerous. Why one man hates children before they are born and another loves them after they are born. None of this will disturb us, because therefore we'll see that it is inevitable that all things come into being in accordance with order, and nevertheless God is not petitioned in vain. Or even better, there it is. From Plotinus, Augustine actually improves on this, but this is the general idea. Plotinus says it more clearly, that we are like people ignorant of a painting who complain that the colors are not everywhere beautiful in the picture, but the artist has laid the appropriate tint to every spot. Augustine takes up this idea in the Confessions and says, "To thee, God, there is no such thing as evil, and even in thy creation taken as a whole there is not, because there is nothing from beyond that can burst in to destroy the order that thou hast appointed for it. But in the parts of creation, some things, because they do not harmonize with others, are considered evil. Yet those things harmonize with others and are good, and in themselves are good. Because of this, I no longer desired a better world, because my thoughts ranged over all, and with sounder judgment I reflected that the things above were better than the things below, yet that all creation together was better than the higher things alone." So, in a way, you give a nice justification of hell here, because it all serves for the greater good. If you read, the most famous literary attack on theism, Ivan Karamazov's Rebellion in Brothers Karamazov, that's what he's talking about. He says he can only see the world from his narrow human point of view, and it doesn't look too good. He's sure that, on the resurrection morning, perhaps he will see it from the point of view of the whole that Augustine talks about, but, he can't now. Or, if you consider, my favorite version of this is in Dante in the Paradiso, when Dante is led by Beatrice through into the beatific vision at the end. And what happens, if you remember correctly, after we've been through both hell and purgatory, both Dante and Beatrice turn away from each other and see the divine beauty and forget each other, absorbed in the divine beauty. Another great version of this is Pilgrim's Progress, where a pilgrim running away from his family at the beginning, who are beckoning him to return, covers his ears and runs along yelling, "Eternal life, eternal life." Okay, because the greatness of the vision is supposed to take care of all of the suffering that happens in it. For the Twains, the Karamatsovs, and the Ryuas among us, such a position seems not to take the suffering of living beings seriously enough. And in its non-universalist iterations, the position requires the eternal damnation of a significant portion of the human race, for the perfect whole includes hell. But what if there is genuine evil? What if hell, holocausts, and all the horrors of history don't contribute to the overall beauty of the universe? Mormons, like process theologians, tend to reject creation ex nihilo. Now, let's see. Quiz. That is supposed to be Joseph Smith, but who is it really? It's Vincent Price. Anybody remember Vincent Price? If you've seen B horror movies from the 1960s, he's in all of them. Okay, but one of his first roles was playing Joseph Smith in the 1940 movie Brigham Young. So, yeah. It's Catherine Keller over there. Okay. In the 1844 King Follett Discourse, Joseph Smith explicitly rejected creation ex nihilo and affirmed the notion of creation from chaos, contending that God organized the world from chaotic matter as a human being might, quoting Smith, organize materials to build a ship. Hence, we infer, quoting again from Smith, that God had the materials to organize a world out of chaos, chaotic matter, which is element and which dwells in glory. Element had an existence from the time he had. The pure principles of element, there we go, can never be created or destroyed. They may be organized and reorganized, but not destroyed. They had no beginning and have no end. There's the entire quote that I just gave. Like process theologians, Mormons reject the notion of a personal creator God as the sole ground of being. In traditional forms of theism, creation ex nihilo protects the power and knowledge and transcendence of God. In giving up creation ex nihilo, Mormons essentially give up the absolutism of God as it is usually understood. Along with this, Mormons gave up the absolute transcendence of God as well. God is involved in space and time. But Smith continued his discourse in even a more radical vein. The first principles of man are self-existent with God. God himself, finding he was in the midst of spirits of glory because he was more intelligent, saw proper to institute laws whereby the rest could have the privilege to advance like himself. So the idea here is for a deification of humanity in some kind of divine community. Human beings existed premortally and in some sense eternally, although what that isn't altogether clear, and are not ontologically different from God, and thus can become like God. Thus, Mormons give up God's other transcendence, placing God within the cosmic struggle in space and time with chaos in order to bring, space and time with chaos to bring order to community and reality. Such a position frees God from Twain's critique that God could make good children as easily as bad, yet preferred to make bad ones, placing God with humans within the struggle and giving God on that power and knowledge that is possible for a being to have eliminates the critiques that might pertain to an utterly transcendent and omnipotent being. At the same time, however, they may open God to critiques about deity's power to save the world from ultimate chaos. Perhaps the key passage in LDS scripture that reveals the Mormon understanding of the existence of suffering and evil is found in the Book of Mormon assertion that there is opposition in all things. Here, the movement from the unity of undifferentiated chaos to the actuality of existence described by later Mormon theologians and teachers finds its scriptural origin. Here's the passage from the Book of Mormon. For it must needs be that there is an opposition in all things. If not so, righteousness could not be brought to pass, neither wickedness, neither holiness nor misery, neither good nor bad, wherefore all things must need be a compound in one. Having no life, neither death, nor corruption, nor incorruption, happiness, nor misery, wherefore there would have been no purpose in the ends of creation, wherefore this thing must needs destroy the wisdom of God and the power and the mercy and justice of God. I think this passage is fascinating, in several respects. One is the distinction that's made, and it's been made by several people, including the German mystic Jakob Böhme, not a Mormon, the German idealist philosopher Schelling, Nikolai Berdyaev, it's in Robert Neville's writings more recently, that the absolute is not personal. The absolute is impersonal. But at the same time, and this is true especially for Böhme, Schelling, and Berdyaev, to move away from the absolute toward the personal, toward the finite, is actually an advance. Okay, I'm not going to really spend much time with that idea here, but it's, I think, critical to understanding what's going on at this point in this passage. Personal beings emerge with opposition, otherness, and in relation with others. Without the creature, without nature, without real others, there is no determination about reality. There's nothing to say about it. It is not will, not body, not space. If one can call such a being perfect, it would have to be the perfection of perfect vagueness, perfectly boring and perfectly empty. The centrality of the personality of God, a personality tied to choice in relation to others, is central to Mormonism. The idea appears, thus, in the Book of Mormon, and this is the Book of Mormon prophet Lehi's instructions to his son. God creates the world in relation to already existing and perhaps eternal chaos. The eschatology that is described in this passage reflects a movement from an unconscious or dead unity in either Eden or earlier, perhaps in the premortal existence in which humans are in the presence of God, or in the unity of the primal chaos before God's created acts, to an alienated conflictual multiplicity that is this world, and then finally into a freely chosen conscious unity in which multiplicity or sociality or the sociality of love in both this world and in the world to come, where Jesus' proudest boast will be that the unity came about through unfettered choice of all concerned. In this view, the plurality of the world, with all its conflicts, is clearly superior to the serenity of the one. But this also means that evil is possible. The actuation of freedom entails the whole sweep of human history, with its multifaceted instantiation of the possibility of good and evil. With the monolithic identity of mere nature left behind the actual God, the Word in the form of humanity and creation suffers through all human history. The movement from the serenity and oneness to the difficulties and richness of the world is superior to the eternity thought of as a static, unchanging perfection. But the opposition of all things always had a potential for dynamism. It is the potentiality at the heart of freedom. But it is also the possibility of everything that happens, good as well as evil, happiness as well as evil, as well as suffering. Out of that which precedes the opposition of all things, reason and unreason emerge. good and evil, joy and pain, all oppositions are born. The fall from Eden produces the possibility of a choice between the opposites of liberty and life on the one side and captivity and death on the other. This is a very fortunate fall in which human beings become subjects capable of choice, eventually capable of becoming like God, but also capable of greater evil. But this is not simply human evil that Lehi describes. The opposition goes all the way down. The potentiality of freedom, this is very much something that is similar to process theology, is the source of all things that exist, but also makes, of course, possible joy and suffering. This is the unavoidable structure of reality that has God and humanity working to create love and order through chaos and potentiality. Adam fell, that men might be, and men are, that they might have joy. Excuse me for the sexist language, it's 19th century text. Okay. LDS philosopher David Paulson has interpreted this text as a new understanding of divine omnipotence, suggesting that God has the power to bring about a state of affairs consistent with the nature of eternal existences. This allows, says Paulson, to take This allows us, says Paulson, to take an instrumentalist view of evil, where pain and suffering become means to spiritual development. God is omnipotent, but he cannot prevent evil without preventing greater goods or ends, soul-making, joy, eternal, godlike life, the value of which more than offsets the disvalue of evil. That's Paulson. I think this passage refers to something more radical than an instrumentalist view, however, wherein evil, the foundational status of opposition suggests that the struggle is just the very nature of reality. To exist is to suffer. God is also involved in this struggle, and the opposition goes all the way down. As with process thought, there is an unavoidably tragic element to existence. As Whitehead said, God is the fellow sufferer who cares. Or as Charles Hartshorne put it, one must find joy in tragedy, or one will not find it. And this is true of God as well. God is also involved in the struggle. The opposition, as I said, goes all the way down. God is also trying to create a world from the chaos of reality. And this is to be involved in this struggle. God is trying to create a world. I just repeated the same sentence, sorry. The movement from unity to meaninglessness of the compound in one, to the struggle for the opposition of all things that includes the possibility of suffering and evil, is the movement to the creation of the subject as a person. Another Book of Mormon prophet, Alma, discusses the fall as a movement from the innocence of the garden to the becoming of subjects or persons capable of following their own will. Now we see that the man has become God, knowing good and evil, or lest he should put forth his hand and take also of the tree of life and eat and live forever. The Lord God placed cherubim and a flaming sword that he should not partake of the fruit. And now we see that our first parents were cut off temporally and spiritually. Here's the alienation, but the alienation has to exist in order for you to be a person. Separation has to be there from the presence of the Lord, and now they became subjects to follow after their own will. Okay, there's some problems here I want to talk about. This is a great David Caspar Friedrich painting from Romantic period. The two key elements of Twain's critique, that God did not make the world, that God didn't need to make the world, and that God has no morals. John Hick argues that we need to gain virtue, but God didn't. God was eternally virtuous. But the soul-making is all the way down in Mormonism. Here, Mormonism, at least as it is interpreted by some Mormon thinkers, shows itself at odds not only with most traditional theists, but possibly with process theology itself. What is it to be holy? What is it to be ethically good? can one be good who has never been tempted, who really does not know what it is to make a moral choice? Charles Hartshorne is correct in his critique of Anselm's explanation of compassion and St. Thomas's explanation of God's love. In each case, they fail to see that being moved by another is key to these virtues. But some Mormons have carried this critique of impassibility beyond compassion to moral goodness. Being morally good is to feel, and this is the key part, at least to have felt, the temptation to evil and resisted it. This is the power of Christ's prayer in the garden, that the cup be taken from him, or the note of despair on the cross. It is in these moments, perhaps, that we feel the greatest solidarity with him. This is certainly the case in LDS Scripture. In a letter from the Liberty Jail, where Joseph Smith was kept a prisoner, that became section 122 of the Doctrine and Covenants, Joseph Smith's revelation, he prays for relief, his relief and that of his people. The effectiveness of Christ's response is that this experience will be for his good and depends on the rhetorical query, the Son of Man, quote, "The Son of Man has descended below them all, art thou greater than he?" Since LDS doctrine holds that Christ is the Jehovah of the Old Testament, in contrast with the answer given by Christ to Joseph Smith, the contrast between the answer given by Christ to Joseph Smith and Jehovah to Job is important. Jehovah seems almost perplexed by Job's complaints, demonstrates his power over the forces of evil and chaos, the Leviathan and Rahab, and Job is silenced. Job 38-40. Jehovah seems not to understand why Job complains and is tempted to despair. In the Mormon tradition, the Yahweh of the Hebrew Bible is as yet the unembodied Christ. One might interpret the passage to say that Jehovah has not yet become embodied. He's not yet perfect. He does not know what it is to suffer. Indeed, this is what the prophet Alma, again from the Book of Mormon, seems to say. Let's see, do I have this? No, I don't have this. And he will take upon him death, he's describing Jesus, and that he may loose the bands of death which bind his people, that he may take upon him their infirmities, that his bowels may be filled with mercy according to the flesh, that he may know according to the flesh how to succor his people according to their infirmities. The experience of embodiment, including the temptation to do evil, plays an important part in the perfection. And it may be the difference between Christ saying, be ye therefore perfect, as your Father in heaven is perfect in Matthew 5:28, and then in the Book of Mormon version of this that's post-resurrection, where he says, be ye therefore perfect, even as I, or your Father in heaven, is perfect, in 3 Nephi 12:48. Jesus does not claim perfection until after the resurrection. The experience of life, suffering, despair, death, temptation, and the victory over them, far more than power, is the reason to worship Christ. In fact, in section 88 and 121 of the Doctrine and Covenants, these are the sources of divine power. What makes Ivan Karamazov's story in the Grand Inquisitor so powerful is that the Grand Inquisitor attacks Christ on the point that traditional Christianity has made so important, his difference from us. Christ as God possesses freedom and power and will that is qualitatively different from humans. So he can turn down the temptations of bread, power, and security. A moral triumph that the Grand Inquisitor believes is beyond human capacity. It is God's, or as Kant would say, it is God's holy will that Ivan attacks in the story. The Inquisitor asks how Christ, a God, for whom temptation is hardly real because he is so strong, can demand a free response from humans who are not so powerful to resist the temptations of bread, security, and power. If one is naturally good and has only an abstract comprehension of alienation, fear, and temptation to despair, how can we say that he or she really understands the other person and can demand moral goodness of them. This is true in The Mysterious Stranger as well. We must remain with the suffering creatures in the dark part of God's beautiful painting. If God is to be good in any human sense of the term, God has to experience temptation and overcome it. Goodness is a matter of will and not being. This is the strength of Smith's teaching in the, let's see, what time do I have? Okay. Where am I? This is the strength of Smith's teaching in the non-canonical King Follett Discourse, that God was once human. God remembers what it was to be tempted. In becoming God, God has overcome temptation, but this is a question of will. When Alma says that were God, this is in the Book of Mormon again, were God to coerce our repentance, even though acting out of his mercy, mercy would rob justice and God would cease to be God. So it seems possible, at least metaphysically possible, that God could coerce us. But the fact is, God will never do this. And there's a key there, too, that comes up later in the paper, and I'm going to skip some things, but that God seems to mean two things for Mormons, both a personal being and a kind of a job description. Okay, I'll get to that. This is not to say with John Hick and traditional free will theologians that God freely limits his power that we might also be free. Rather, that though it might be possible for God as a person to coerce, with that act, God would cease to be God. For to be God is to be morally perfect. God cares in part because God is, while a finite human person, developed compassion through the experience of temptation and suffering in human existence. God thus fully realizes how significant temptation and suffering are in human beings because God experienced mortality. Joseph Smith and the Mormon theologian B.H. Roberts describe God as a person morally perfected in love who is fully related to other persons. A part of this perfection, at least according to the King Follett Discourse, in the case of the Father, has been the experience of life as individual with all its temptations. Of course, this leads to certain Promethean elements. There's a Mormon joke that you find on the internet, a man who was met by St. Peter. And one of the, kind of like Dante, one of the joys of achieving immortality is you're given a tour of heaven and hell. And Peter doesn't have the time to take the guy on the tour of hell, and so he takes him down to hell. One of the angels takes him down to hell. The guy comes back, and he says, well, hell's really pretty nice. And Peter looks at him and he says, damn it, the Mormons are irrigating again. That's the source of this folk joke seems to come from a statement made by Joseph Smith. These are Promethean elements here. That where he said, I see no faults in the church, and therefore let me be resurrected with the saints, whether I ascend to heaven or descend to hell, or go any other place. And if we go to hell, we will turn out the devils and make a heaven of it. Mormon philosopher William H. Chamberlain, who was a student of Josiah Royce, claimed that God requires human cooperation in overcoming the chaos of the world. Zion, he believed, cannot be built with divine hands alone. Now, all this reveals a kind of Promethean element to the Mormon solution to the problem of evil that goes on to things like redemption of the dead, if you think of what Ivan says in the Brothers Karamazov, one of the problems with the problem of evil is if you push it, a Promethean solution to the problem into the future, say a Marxist solution, then what about the billions of people who have died in the past? There's no justice for them. So Ivan says that even that kind of solution is unacceptable. It's interesting. There was Lenin's Secretary of Culture is a guy named Lunacharsky, who there's a whole tradition of this in Russia, but a materialist tradition of it too, said that the great human project had to be the resurrection of the dead. Now, for Lunacharsky, that was a technological thing. You were going to somehow reconstitute the dead, kind of like Jurassic Park. Okay. But Mormons did this as well. In the Doctrine and Covenants, he quotes Joseph Smith, and this goes way back to Joseph Smith's first stories of his visions. This passage from Malachi that I will send Elijah the prophet before the coming of the great and dreadful day of the Lord, and he shall turn the heart of the fathers to the children and the heart of the children to the fathers. And he says what this means is you have to remember your ancestors and you have to do things for them. And he goes on, he says, between the fathers and the children upon some subject or other, behold, what was that subject? It is the baptism of the dead. For we cannot be made perfect we without them cannot be made perfect, neither can they without us be made perfect. So there's this big kind of contract between the living and the dead. They have to be remembered. They have to be brought in somehow. That's why, when all you folks die, Mormons will try to baptize you. Anyway. Okay. Now, we look at these kind of Promethean elements in Mormonism, and they appear incredibly optimistic, utopian, perfectionist, Neo-Pelagian, and you could do that. That would be, I think, to miss their uniqueness. The central figure in overcoming evil and death for Mormons is Christ. It is Christ who shows the way and opens the possibility of any of the seeming Promethean characteristics of Mormon perfectionism. Like all humanity, Christ is the divine become human, a premortally existing being made flesh. Unlike the rest of humanity, Christ bears the whole, this is the key difference, the whole of human suffering upon him. He not only suffers for our sins, he's supposed to have suffered our pains. And so let me read a passage from the Book of Mormon. And he comes, behold, he cometh into the world that he may save all men if they will hearken to his voice. But behold, he suffers the pain of all men, of every living creature, both men, women, and children who belong to the family of Adam. Let's see. So the idea here, and I'm going to cut some of this short, is what Christ does is to pull us away from ourselves, from an essentially self-centered being, this is what the Mormon version of the atonement would be, toward what in the Book of Mormon is called a mighty change of heart. And like Christ, to be more concerned with others than ourselves. This is a type of kenosis in which like Christ, we empty ourselves of our claims on divinity and become the servants of others, joining them in suffering. There are several passages in the Book of Mormon that say this explicitly. But is such a being powerful enough? Traditional theists and creedal Christians bedeviled by the problem of evil must continually return to it and discover ways to defend the justice of God amidst the suffering of the world. In a similar ways, Mormons will always confront the problem of whether their understanding of God can provide a being powerful enough to end evil, chaos, and suffering. This basic Mormon response to this question has to be along the lines of a universe that is social and relational. Evil is born of chaos, and egoism will show itself to be ultimately unworkable and eventually destroy itself. This seems to be the message of the Mormon scriptural tradition. In section 76 of the Doctrine and Covenants, that is referred to Mormons as the vision, for it lays for the way it lays out the purposes of the Mormon plan of the purposes of the Mormon plan of salvation. Speaks of a final victory over chaos of death in terms of the deification of humanity. The sources of evil, of suffering and chaos arise with individuation in life. They are part of the opposition of all things, but they are part of the also a source of our freedom and joy. Natural evil and suffering arise with the creation of the world and are a part of, and it will take time to overcome them. It is an infinite task. In this sense, one could say that for Mormons, the creation of the world is ongoing and will not be completed until the establishment of the kingdom of heaven. Moral evil arises from the opposition, but from the possibility of individuality and freedom. If I am free, I can refuse to enter into relation with another and with God. I can turn my back on the poor man who asks for my help. I can turn my back on God and deny the relational character of reality. In this respect, Jesus is the obedient Son and the archetype of moral self-sacrifice, and Satan is the archetype of self-will. A key observation of Douglas Davies in his Joseph Smith, Jesus and Satanic Opposition, Atonement, Evil, and the Mormon Vision, is that for Mormonism, evil is associated with apostasy from the truth, with willful rebellion. Satan is the archetype of such rebellion through his extreme self-will. Evil is rebellion against the community, the effort to make oneself God over all, including all other heavenly beings that create the earth, the world. Douglas Davies writes about the Great Council of Heaven. The Heavenly Council reveals the obedient unanimity cohering. Jesus is obedience in the absence of command. Lucifer pleased only himself through desire for personal glory, revealing a profound disobedience. Gethsemane manifests its outworking of that obedience in Christ's direct engagement with evil to make atonement for humanity. So it's this creation of a community is what is aimed at. In fact, where obedience and acceptance, answering the call of the other, leads to the creation of love, apostasy ends in isolation and self-centered. The self-centered egoist cuts himself off from all others. Since reality is founded on relation to others, the egoist loses his relation to reality. The Mormon apostle John A. Whitsoe saw beings withering toward but never achieving nothingness. Quoting Whitsoe, as they are eternal, it is doubtful they could ever fully destroy themselves. Nevertheless, as they oppose the law, they will shrivel up and become as if they were not. Brigham Young went further, saying these sons of perdition would fall into their component parts and cease to exist as individuals, because to exist as a person is to always exist in relation to others. We just move to the kind of final minutes of this. This is a passage from the book from the Doctrine and Covenants. The end of evil comes only when we achieve a kind of sociality. And so this, in section 130, it says here that when the Savior shall appear, we will be like him as he is. We will see that he is a man like ourselves. And that same sociality which exists among us here will exist among us there, only it will be coupled with eternal glory, which glory we do not now enjoy. So the idea is that the creation of a community, creation of and recognition of relationality with other persons and with all things is what would be the creation of the kingdom of heaven. Want to go to Marjorie Suhaki here and try and make a kind of final statement, bringing Mormonism and at least some types of Mormon theology and process theology together here. In The End of Evil, Marjorie's first book, or I think it was her dissertation, she turned it into a book, we end with this real commitment to sociality and to the idea that God may be a community. So let me just read this. The judgment is multiple. It is a judgment of the occasion, as it could have been relative to what it in fact become. It is a judgment, the occasion as a single satisfaction, this is Whiteheadian language, in relation to the communities in which it participated, such as the totality of a living person. It is a judgment of the occasion, and if applicable to its personhood, in relation to increasingly wider communities of the whole universe. And it is throughout, of course, the judgment of the occasion in relation to God. I'm going to end with at least something sort of similar from a Mormon theologian. Remember, when I was talking earlier, there seems to be, at least the way I see it, in Mormonism, a differentiation between the absolute and God. Okay, so you put this in Tillichian terms of there's a God and there's a God beyond God, or in terms that we were just looking at with Marjorie Suhaki, that the absolute might not be seen as a single person, but as a community of persons. B.H. Roberts lived around the turn of the 20th century, 19th and 20th century, said, man, by the very nature of him, is a son of God and participant in the divine nature. He is properly a part of God, that is, God conceived in the generic sense, as made up of a whole assemblance of divine intelligence that exists in all heavens and all earths. So I'm going to end right there and open it up to questions, discussion, disagreements. Looks like Deidre disagrees already. Okay.
We'll build up to disagreement. I'm going to start with a question.
Okay.
It's a question that is so absurd it doesn't merit being called heterodox, but since we're talking about Mormonism and process that, I'm going to ask it. Is God in the process of God's own soul making? God,
from Mormon perspective or from process?
Well, no. Yeah, both.
Okay.
Clearly, God, from a Mormon perspective, clearly God is in the process of making other souls, but is God in the process of making God's soul?
I would think so. I would think so. Because you would. Let me just take the Mormon position first. Now, lean on John or somebody else for help with process. But I would think that if you're going to claim that there's somehow this kind of development of love, and that each individual being does that in a particular way, then to be perfect, as Hartshorne talks about, is to be constantly being enriched, enriched by all things. So I would say, God's in a constant state of soul making. Would make one caveat to that, though. I don't think and that was a bad thing to say, because I've read Erastus Snow after you read that paper. God, if you look at God as a community of beings, or as or a divine couple, if you want to go that way with it too, that and I think this is what Roberts is aiming at, there's a certain kind of moral perfection here, that you don't close yourself off, that you're always open. That kind of thing you've advanced to a point where, no, you're not going to turn around and be a jerk again.
Can I ask a follow-up
Sure.
question then? So on that view then, I think if we look at different analytic philosophy of religion approaches to the problem of evil, God choosing not to intervene in human life at particular times or all of the time or most of the time serves a purpose of soul making for human beings. But would God's choice not to intervene in human life have anything to do with God's own process of soul making?
In process theology or for Mormons? This is something I've always wondered about with, because I'm so drawn to process theology. I had this discussion with a couple of the open theists, John Sanders and Clark Pinnock. And their objection to process theology is that God doesn't actively get in and change things. God is Lord. And I used to think that was a powerful critique of process theology. I don't anymore. Because it makes God look really bad if God picks and chooses when God will be involved in the universe. That kid in the trunk there dying. Every once in a while a baby, climbs in a trunk or in a car, why isn't the latch break? Or why didn't God, when Hitler applied to the Art Institute in Vienna, why did he just move that paper over from the rejection to the acceptance pile? I would think that, God functions as a lure, as an influence, but it has to do not with God limiting God's power, it's just the nature of reality. The difference that Mormons would have, I think, with it is that by proposing the idea, they're real anthropomorphous. You have the generic idea of God here, and that would be that one. But then, God could, I'd really like to. God would have some coercive power. But to be God would be not to use it. Yeah.
So, soul making makes a lot of sense, at least in the context of an anthropocentric concern, right? So, but when we start thinking, in Mormonism, for instance, the animals have souls. Can animals suffer? Is God somehow culpable for not preventing the suffering of non-human creatures?
In Mormonism, we don't have. Richard and Deidre are here. Mormons come to Claremont, but we don't, on the whole, have theologians. Like, these guys will never get a job at a Mormon university. No, they'll get jobs, but not at a Mormon university because we just don't. But there are only two of them, and they don't hire people. Okay, but they maybe in the philosophy department. So it's mainly been a kind of folk theology with a few moments of people writing things, and then, but that kind of folk theology is also kind of nice about it. Joseph Smith, for example, thought there were gods, there were animal gods for animals. He talks of there are places in his sermons where he. There is an idea where and in the old days. Mormons don't drink, right? And we're not supposed to drink coffee or tea too, although right now Coke is okay. When I was a kid, it wasn't. But there is in that word of wisdom, that section where it talks about Mormon dietary principles. There is a passage that says you're only supposed to eat very little meat and only in times of famine. And part of the reason was that you make animals suffer. And some of the early Mormon presidents of the church, Lorenzo Snow and Wilford Woodruff, thought that vegetarianism was something that Mormons should be into, because otherwise, and they would have these humanitarian days where Mormons would come out and take and celebrate their animals and all that. That didn't last, and but the possibility is back there. Yeah, Richard.
Yeah, it might be worth pointing out. So in Mormonism, there's a lot of things where there may not be an official sort of quote, creedal
Sure.
theological point of view, but you can say there's a widely held point of view. There are widely shared beliefs. And I think it's fair to say that it's a widely shared belief that animals have something like a human soul.
Mm-hmm.
So it may not have been officially codified in a really formal sense, but I think it's fair to say if you ask most Mormons, leaders and lay members,
Yeah.
about the question of souls, they would probably say, I think so. I think dogs or cats or my pet or my horse or whatever.
So then
has
can you
something
also
like
take
soul.
that next step to say that animals suffer
Yeah.
so that they can be made better?
Yeah, they
Dogs,
probably,
cats, etc.
yeah, they probably wouldn't say that because they don't see animals as having the same kind of freedom of will, freedom of the will, or agency.
Or
as
serving the
humans.
same purpose.
Yeah, it wouldn't.
Experiencing mortality.
Yeah, that one thing that I would take out the "so that" for everybody. I know that a lot of Mormons will talk like this, but the "so that" I think that the existence is just suffering. And Mormons should just buy what the Buddhist said. It's also joy. They'd add that, but.
But not just human existence is suffering, but
No.
Anything that comes into being. I mean, you could have, and Hartshorne is so great for this, because he talks about you can't imagine an omniscient being who would be blissful, perfectly blissful. I think that's true because if you're an omniscient being or anything like unto it, you're aware of what's going on. How can you be blissful?
I think that might be a nice segue into I had a couple questions, but my biggest question has to do with this question of omniscience and omnipotence. And so you suggest that to the extent that there is a problem of evil for Mormons, it probably has to do more with their eschatology than any ideas about, say, their ontology, about current conditions.
Yeah.
The problem arises most...
Is there an end to
sharply-
evil?
Right, yeah. It arises most sharply for you in what might happen in the future versus what's going on here and now in the present. I think.
Well,
what I
in the sense that I think Mormons are far closer to Buddhists in the sense that, yeah, evil exists. Suffering happens. I guess if we're going to be honestly a Buddhist, I'd have to not say evil exists, I have to say suffering happens. But, and you really should do something about it, because that's the only way it's going to get done. Now, this is where I would probably be different than most. If you were to stop a Mormon on the street, they're looking forward to the end of time when all suffering is wiped out. I am too, but it's like what Kant called an infinite task, meaning it's logically possible that evil could cease. We could all start being what we should be. Everything could cooperate. That's logically possible, right? William Sororin's great play. Now I forget the title. Or the character of Markle in Brothers Karamazov, where he just says, we could have paradise tomorrow. All we have to do is love each other. That sounds pie in the sky, but yeah, that's logically possible. Maybe not tomorrow, soon. But yeah, will it happen? There's no force from the outside that's going to come in and make it happen.
Okay, so that was kind of my question. I guess I'm trying to differentiate between, or pick up, it's been a little bit difficult to pick up what you're sort of advocating, or what you might be arguing for in a constructive theological sense, and what you might be observing as the Mormon, right? Because this is kind of set up as a Mormon process, Theodicy. Yeah. And it seems to me that the problem of evil, the Mormon problem of evil, if I'm going to talk about perhaps most widely shared beliefs, the problem seems to arise pretty sharply in many other places. For example, and the thing that led me to this was Andrew's comment about animals and God's sharing and human suffering is, I think, one of the places in Mormon scripture where the problem emerges in a really powerful way is in the Mormon book of Moses.
Yeah.
Chapter 7 and chapter 8. In chapter 7 in this book of Moses, you have God weeping over what he sees, right? So the question is, could you you have a divine being who's literally suffering to the point of weeping over what he sees happening in the world. And the next chapter, the very next chapter, you have that same weeping, suffering, sharing in the pain God. You have that God destroy the world.
Yeah.
Literally wipe the entire planet clean, right? Something like omnicide.
Yeah.
So that seems to me a God with that kind of power, right? That's power in the big sense, but then there's God with power in the smallest senses. You hear Mormons every day talk about God in the small sense, performing the best word is supernatural stuff, doing all kinds of supernatural stuff. So it seems to me there's really, really commonly, widely shared Mormon beliefs in a God with a kind of omnipotence
power
that goes right alongside, right? That looks exactly like classical Christian views.
Yeah, there's, Okay, let me see if I can respond to that.
So all I want to say is, to that extent, it looks like the Mormon problem looks very, very similar to the classical Christian problem, to the extent that there's such a massively influential theology of omnipotence.
Let me. I'm going to cheat in this response. Okay. Mormons have this sense of what they call the apostasy. Right. The apostasy is that everybody got it wrong after Jesus died. Okay. And one of the big things they got wrong was they created this God, this omniscient, omnipotent God of classical theology. Power. And then the problem of evil comes up with that. I would say that we're never free of that. We share so much. Mormons want to be Christians so badly, in the sense of accepted by other Christians, that we use a lot of the same language. And that's the inconsistency that I was talking about at the beginning of the paper, where Mormons oftentimes seek to have it both ways. Let's say, God can, destroy all our enemies, blah, 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 blah. Why doesn't he do it? Well, because God can't do it, because he knows. Okay? So that's one way to look at it. The other way is, you look at the story in Moses chapter 8. This is, the Noah thing. God destroys the whole world. There's a really nice section in Twain's Mysterious Stranger about this. I remember being at the AAR once. Anybody know Wesley Wildman? Wesley was talking about something that his little boy came home from church crying. And he said, well, what's the matter? He says, our teacher told us the story of Noah's Ark. You think of usually, 5-year-olds, they love the story of Noah's Ark. Animals all around the place. The little boy said, God killed all the animals. He's this big jerk up there. The way I like to look at this, what saves those stories for me is, one, that they're stories. Two, that both in the biblical version and the Mormon pseudepigrapha on it, they talk about the world being totally corrupt and filled with violence. Now, if you think, one of my favorite writers about eschatology is somebody who's popular amongst process theologians, is the Russian philosopher Nikolai Berdyaev. And Berdyaev, when he writes eschatologically about the end of evil, he says, well, what's happening here, he's coming out of German idealistic tradition as well as Russian tradition, is evil will burn itself out. Evil is violence. And if you carry it to the end, it destroys itself. So if you're going to survive, you're going to have to stop doing this crap. And we're going to have to stop having a God that does it as well. So yeah, there you go. That's as good a response as I can give you. So if Mormons are going to survive, we're going to have to, forget this. We're going to have to stop waiting. After Joseph Smith was killed, Mormons used to, you talk to some people and they say, we never did this. But apparently we did. In the temple ceremony, they would do a ritual praying for the suffering of death of those people who killed Joseph Smith. I remember growing up and having all these folk stories told to me about the fate of the persecutors of Joseph Smith. And there was this one guy who he died and rotted. Worms crawled out of him and everything. And you grew up with those folk stories. Yes, here's justice. And then later read it that no, that never happened to the guy. He was a successful businessman and died in bed. So it's you got to give. We like everybody else, I think, has to just give up that stuff.
We've got about 5 minutes for comments, questions, concerns.
Carrie and I are actually working on a book on Mormon process theology, and this is a chapter in the book. In the ideal sense. Yeah, we're not going to, we're going to do it the way we would like it to be.
No, we haven't started yet.
Oh, yeah, I've got about 10 articles I've written on this.
But I haven't.
It's interesting, you mentioned, you've been in dialogue with some open theists, Sanders and others, and I've heard some people do a presentation connecting, comparing and contrasting evangelicalism with Mormonism. And I just find it interesting. I wonder if there might be more inroads with open theism specifically for Mormon dialogue than with process proper.
I'd rather it be process.
Yeah.
But it's true. It's true. John Sanders. As a matter of fact, we're just publishing 2 issues of the journal. The first issue is on Mormonism and process. The second issue is on Mormonism and open theism. And we have articles by John Sanders in there and Aaron Simmons. And Simmons and Pinnock and Sanders talked at BYU several times. And, there's a really interesting book out now by a guy who's a professor of Japanese at Tufts University, Charles Inouye. It's a book on Mormon eschatology, and he does the right thing. He takes us away from that direction and pulls us toward Buddhism, which
You seem to be.
I don't think will ever happen, but I'd sure like to see it happen.
I think Orthodox, to the extent there is Orthodox Mormon thinking, fits much better with open theism, and heterodox. Heterodox thought that, like Jim and I were sharing in common, fits much better with process.
But there's so many similarities
Hey,
in process and open theism. I'm just wondering if that might be the first step into the door.
Okay, it could be. But the thing is, I think that Richard's wrong there. I think there is no more Orthodox Mormon thinking. There's only heterodox Mormon thinking. It's just heterodox in a bunch of different ways. We've never figured it out that much, that orthodoxy.
One of the things that makes it different and really refreshing is the idea of pre-existence.
Yeah.
And that goes along with Buddhism in some sort of sense.
Yeah, it was always been easier for me to buy into the idea that, that not only is it pre-existing, but you have time to fix it later in Mormonism. And that's like Buddhism. One thing that we could never do with buying rebirth completely is like you establish a relationship with another person here, like her. That's got to last forever. I mean, I can't do another one later with somebody else, even though my grandfather had 3 wives. I hope that was a mistake. But I'm here because of it. So, anyway.
I'm approaching this not as a philosopher of religion, but more from the standpoint of comparative theology. I just want to understand. Do you ever hear the view that Mormon theology is henotheistic?
Yeah.
Would that be I mean, in terms of a global comparison? It's henotheistic. And then that it might resemble Eastern Orthodox Christianity in the theosis approach.
Yeah.
And then thirdly, in regard to theodicy, would you say it's more of a practical theodicy? I mean, given the view of opposites and kind of a God built into the world, that the only theodicy you're going to get is if you form this community, this beloved community.
Yeah, I agree. I think the henotheistic thing is good.
That helps me a lot. I can teach that.
I think also, and some Mormons would probably disagree with me on that. I think we might even go as far as cathenotheism.
What is that?
Max Mueller developed this idea in talking about Hinduism, cathenotheism. And whether it's proper about Hinduism or not, Mueller was trying. But I've always thought might be a good way to think about Mormonism, because Mormons have this idea of this many gods, okay? But there's only one God. Cathenotheism is that you are devoted to the one God as the only God as you're worshiping that God. It's like, oh no, I'm not going to say that. There was a bad pop song there that popped into my head, but I'm going to leave that alone. Okay.
In other writings, you've suggested that our commitment to our religion and our God is like our commitment to our spouse.
Yeah.
You are the best spouse. You're the only spouse I have.
Yeah.
But you are the best spouse.
Yeah. I think. I would still say that. The practical thing, I think that's where a lot of it comes from. The stuff about Joseph Smith, when he starts talking about work for the dead, people lost children in infancy a lot. They lost parents and stuff. And when he revealed that in Nauvoo in the late 1830s, I think, people just loved it, because the idea was that I could actually do something for the dead. And I think that's a real kind of practical desire. And plus the Promethean elements that, we're going to go out, irrigate and create,
Anyone else with a comment or question?
Sure.
I come from China. This is the first lesson I hear. I came to America yesterday. I'm very proud of you. Here I want to say the Chinese God story. In China, maybe the God topic is a very, very common topic in West countries. But in China, people do not talk about the God. But in China, there is God.
Mm-hmm.
In China, God means natural law.
It means
Natural law. Means natural law.
natural law.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Oh, excuse me.
as a part of nature, the man is the core part of nature. The natural law, the natural law maybe is in human body. This is consciousness. Consciousness in China, consciousness have three meanings. Have three meanings. Yeah. First, consciousness is not strong enough to make the human to do good things. So people often do some evil, bad things.
Mm-hmm.
But the second means is that the conscious in our body is good enough. When we do evil things, we may feel also awful. We feel very badly, very bad.
Mm-hmm.
Even if no other body can see our bad things, bad actions. So in China, we can save a human being by finding our consciousness. So we cannot we don't so we don't
a good form, the law or something like that. The social laws.
So in China, people do some good things not by social law, but by our consciousness.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, I think that's what you have to come to. You have to come, and it's like if you act out of fear, God will punish you. You're just a bad person. You know, Plato talks about this. You're just a bad person who's afraid they'll get caught. Matter of fact, I can admire, and this is why the poet Shelley, 19th century English poet, makes Satan a hero, because at least he doesn't take crap from the tyrant. So, but it has to be here, like yours, in consciousness. It has to be confirmation to a law. You were talking about natural law. In fact, in the 19th century, some early Mormons, like a fellow named Orson Pratt, that's how he described God. God was the personal God, but then there was also the law, the natural law that God had to conform to, and all humans and all the creatures as well. So yeah, you can find that something like
So
as well.
sorry. If you ask the evil is end or not, in China we can say if we want all of things beyond our needs, we maybe we become evil. But our consciousness can make our want become
Small?
sorry.
Become smaller, perhaps?
Become
Make our wants conform with what's possible?
not our English. It is it becomes logical. Yeah, logical.
Okay.
Yeah, can our consciousness can make our wants become logical. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
So when we do it like this, maybe our society can become full of love.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Maybe in China this means. Thank you.
Good.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So it's not far-fetched to consider parallels between Mormonism process and Chinese thought. Why don't we thank our speaker, and then you can talk to him later.